A president of the United States should stand up and explain the truth. Trump does not do that. Nobody wants to talk about why there was a war, where it came from, how it should stop permanently. What is that all about?
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs went on Glenn Deason's podcast to talk about what Trump's recent meeting with Putin means. Does it mean that a peace agreement may be on the table, that we might be moving in that direction, or more of the same, funding Ukraine till the bitter end, as long as it takes to dislodge Russia from the Donbass? Let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
And only last week he was threatening Russia to accept this unconditional ceasefire that doesn't address the issue of restoring Ukraine's neutrality. And now there's a meeting in Alaska. I was wondering, what is your take on these developments?
Well, I think you've said it exactly right. There's a lot of confusion for us in trying to understand this. Trump does not give speeches to explain his point of view. The government does not put out documents to explain the official policies, if there are such things. Truth Social is not a substitute. It's really a chaotic environment where Trump throws out contradictory, short, ambiguous, or meaningless or incorrect messages on the fly. So the truth is, we see an incoherence in general in American policy now. It reflects, according to some people, a tactic of Trump. According to me, it reflects his personality, which is extraordinarily short-term, not based on detailed knowledge. He says that he makes decisions from the gut. It's not much of a way to run the world. In my view, it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, basically totally agree with this. Truth Social is used as a mechanism to antagonize foreign powers, not only in Ukraine, but also in Iran. Remember when Trump said, hey, if Iran doesn't make itself great again, why not there be a regime change? That's the American substitute for diplomacy and foreign policy as it was once called. Instead of, engaging in foreign powers and talking peace and talking the terms that would lead to peace, you get into these erratic and antagonistic maneuvers that is supposed to make it look like you're in a strong position. But I hate to tell Trump, he's not when it comes to Ukraine, where Russia controls about 90% of the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, all essentially controlled by Russia. Crimea hasn't gone anywhere, and despite all the 200 billions worth of U.S. taxpayer money, it hasn't changed a thing. So going down this road is the same thing that Biden did, and unless you change and go and turn face, like Sachs says, acknowledge that Ukraine will be neutral, it won't be part of NATO, that territory is Russian, there won't be any inroads here. I don't see how it can happen otherwise.
So to answer the question, in short, I don't think we really understand this meeting. I did not expect it. Diplomacy was not operating on the surface, at least for many, many weeks. Suddenly there's this visit of Witkoff to Moscow. The next thing is there's a hastily announced meeting. The venue was uncertain until a couple of days ago. Then it decided that it's going to be in Alaska. As usual, there's a cacophony of voices and contradictory messages and claims circulating around the social media and the mass media. Europe and Zelensky are making their demands. Rumors are flying about who's made what concessions, who agreed to what. It's all extraordinarily unsatisfactory.
Yeah, it's unsatisfactory for sure. This road 6 months into a Trump presidency where he does nothing to disengage, but hey, I'll take this over antagonizing Russia, over appearing on, CNN and Fox News, spreading the same liberal propaganda, NATO propaganda that we were told the whole time that Putin wants all of Ukraine, despite all the evidence in contradiction to that. I'll take talks with Putin. And, I don't think Zelensky necessarily needs to be part of those talks if Trump is willing to do the right thing and ignore the concerns of NATO and Ukraine, pull out completely, and let them deal with it. Let them and Europe determine a peace, come to an agreement with Russia, which would inevitably be the result of U.S. disengagement. And you can say, hey, Putin's just going to invade Poland if they do that, but there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence that Putin's even committed as many troops or resources that would be necessary to take over Ukraine proper, let alone take over Poland, which is just preposterous. This is the war machine propaganda to lead us to an interventionist stance. So, yeah, if discussions are happening, great. But if Trump involves Zelensky into it and just keeps siding with Ukraine, despite all the rhetoric about how he wants peace, it's not going to come to any manner in which could provide peace.
Undignified, improperly managed, childish, dangerous, I would say. Maybe something good will come of this, but the process is simply not acceptable from the point of view of a world of nuclear-armed nations that are at each other's throats. So this is, I think, the basic situation. We can surmise, we could make recommendations about what should be done, but to try to guess what Trump is doing is very, very difficult.
It is. He's erratic. He talks out of both sides of his mouth, and he surrounds himself with both Witkoff and Lindsey Graham. And he surrounds himself with Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio. They're outnumbering the Witkoff faction that I do genuinely think wants peace. He tends to side with the neocons on this. It's money flowing into Ukraine. Interest in this preposterous minerals deal that relies on minerals in territory that Russia occupies anyway. All of it's preposterous, but he's generally sided with the war machine, with the military-industrial complex. I hope that shifts. I hope I have to eat crow over that, but I don't see a stop soon, and it's because of what Julian Assange once said when he said, in relation to Afghanistan, but it applies to Ukraine as well, they don't want a successful war. They want an endless war. And why? It's a constant money stream to the Boeings and Raytheons and Lockheed Martins of the world.
Well, the whole thing, I'm always struck a bit by some optimism because it does seem like an opportunity if there's a genuine desire to, I guess, end a century of US-Russian hostilities and really transform relations because their interests do not need to collide all the time. And again, transition from containment to cooperation. But then my optimism is sometimes held back by the fact that the political establishment in the United States doesn't seem to have changed that much. Or do you see U.S. intentions, that is, its position in the world and its position towards Russia, has changed fundamentally over the past 30 years?
There is a narrative that the U.S. must win and Putin must lose in any outcome. That is a very common narrative in U.S. political circles, and it's a shared narrative in European circles. Well, if you take that as given, first of all, it's almost meaningless concepts. What is win and lose? We're not playing a board game. We're trying or should be trying to achieve peace and well-being.
That's right, but they do view it as a chess game. Brzezinski wrote an article about this in 1997, how this is essentially a chess game with the U.S. empire basically using Ukraine as pawns on a chessboard. Much of this was driven by the U.S. and NATO and not Russia or Ukraine. This is a result of centuries, or I should say decades, of the U.S. moving the NATO alliance eastward and eastward and eastward up into Russia's border. As Mearsheimer says, it's shoving it down their throat, shoving down NATO policy despite the fact that it was broken promises and antagonizing Russia in ways that the U.S. would never accept Russia doing. They wouldn't accept an offensive and defensive missile system being placed on the border of Canada facing the U.S. It wouldn't accept flirting with putting Canada into their military alliance. It just wouldn't. And that's what we're seeing.
In a dangerous world. But win and lose are the concepts that are used. Washington is a very unimpressive place from the point of view of foreign policy thinking towards the common good. Maybe it's very impressive in that it mobilizes more than $1 trillion a year of military spending. It has a freedom of maneuver for the military-industrial complex in the United States that is unparalleled. It's impervious to U.S. public opinion, which would definitely like this war to end. But it's not an impressive operation from the point of view of logic, coherence, certainly not transparency, certainly not explaining anything. You and I agree completely that there is no basis for this war, and there's no basis for an ongoing enmity of the United States and Russia. But the fact of the matter is the CIA doesn't share our view.
That's an understatement.
The military-industrial complex doesn't share our view. Lindsey Graham, who is a fool, nasty man, he doesn't share our view.
Certainly so. That's a charitable view of Lindsey Graham, by the way, by calling him a nasty man, and I agree with it. But if anything, it understates the case because he's a bloodthirsty neocon that wants nothing more than to plunge the United States into debt under a Ukraine first policy. And that's what he's always wanted. He's always been on that side. There's never been a war that he didn't want to fight. But look, the conditions and Russia's desires haven't changed from the get-go. Haven't changed for over a decade. They don't want Ukraine in NATO. They want the U.S. to declare that. They don't want NATO resources in Ukraine. They don't want the U.S. treating Ukraine as a de facto NATO power. They want Ukraine as a buffer zone. And that won't change until the United States acknowledges that Crimea is part of Russia, that the Donbass is now under Russian control, and that Ukraine will not be part of NATO. Trump refuses to say those things. For the most part. One time, I think back in April, he said that Crimea will be part of Russia. He hasn't done anything else other than that, other than to continue to funnel money there, antagonize conflict, and hopefully, though, that this meeting will produce some fruit, but I'm just not seeing it because he's met with that delegation before. It's gone nowhere. There's too much pressure on him to continue the war, to keep the money going to the military-industrial complex. But this hasn't changed. Russia's always one of those things. It put those things in the draft treaty that it sent to NATO on the eve of its invasion of Ukraine. And instead of signing it, saying, we won't put Ukraine in NATO, they scoffed at it, laughed at it, and said, hey, he's going to get war. They wanted this war the whole time.
And Biden didn't share our view. And Trump, I don't know if he has a view. He wants accolades. That's good, maybe. Maybe he wants applause. But what will bring him applause right now? If he settles with Putin, as he should, the President of the United States should say straightforwardly, NATO will not enlarge. We don't have an interest in encircling Russia. We'll stop playing games. Will that bring him accolades? No, it probably would bring him attacks of appeasement.
Not from dissidents. Dissidents would treat him as a hero if he said those things. And guess what? We outnumber, to some extent, the oligarchy that tries to control us. I know they do everything to make that appear unclear with all the influence in the media and things like that, but the people that want out of this and want an actual America First policy, we're, the people that outnumber that oligarchy. And he would be welcomed as a hero if he did that. He's not willing to do that, and he's not truly a populist for those reasons. He is siding with this globalist elite that wants a containment policy and a new Cold War versus Russia, but that's the truth.
Of weakness, of Munich, once again. And since Trump is he's no thinker, he has no knowledge, and he's pretty gutless, actually, in my view, also. He doesn't know how to stand up to any of that. So the answer to the question, I was optimistic when he came in because the underlying logic is that this was a war that never should have happened. This was a war based on NATO enlargement, a war based on a U.S. coup, U.S.-led coup in Ukraine in February 2014, a war based on the Western countries having failed to support and endorse the Minsk II agreements. It was a war based on failures of diplomacy. So, and Trump said he wanted a Nobel Peace Prize. So I thought, okay, we're going to come in and he's going to get this right.
Yeah, I mean, the rhetoric was actually good, and I agree with him. Trump isn't a thinker. In fact, it doesn't really seem like he has much of an ideology at all, but actually, oftentimes his instincts and rhetoric was good on Ukraine when he constantly talked about the fact that he wants people to stop dying. He wants this war to end, but he's been unwilling this entire duration of his presidency to do anything that would end the war, and the U.S. could do that. It's not even a mystery. Disengage, get the US out of it. The European powers couldn't, keep pledging and antagonizing Russia in their own way, devoting all the money to that. I think that would dissipate completely if the US left. They would take it within their interest to solidify a peace agreement, and Zelensky would have no choice either, regardless of what the right-wingers wanted him to do in his state, and the right-wing nationalists and the Azov forces, which are Nazi forces, by the way, which the U.S. media covered as such until Putin launched his invasion in the 7th year of what was a civil war between Ukraine and Russia, where most of the hostility took place in the Donbass even before 2022. So over 3 years, we've had the same policy. Sachs is right. He's being led astray by neocon voices, but he's culpable too because his instincts were right, and he's being led to trust the military-industrial complex over his instincts and best rhetoric.
And there was a glimmer of hope for a moment when he told the truth. And then as soon as he told the truth that NATO was a provocation, everybody landed on his head, from the U.S. Senate to his own advisors, his generals, to Starmer, Schultz at the time, now Merz, Macron. Who wants to tell the truth? Who wants peace? So it's really an odd situation. Zelensky, who's he? He rules by martial law in a regime that everybody regards as utterly corrupt, in a society that is exhausted. They can't expand the cemeteries fast enough. An overwhelming majority of Ukrainians want the war to end. None of it matters.
That's right. Martial law, suppressing political dissent, shutting down adversarial news media, expanding conscription, shutting down Eastern Orthodox churches. What hasn't this guy despite the fact that he's called, some champion of democracy? It's just retarded. It's insane. No one can believe that anymore. And guess what? The moment that Russia lays claim to my treasury, maybe I'll have more things to say about corruption of the Russian regime. But they're not trying to deplete the U.S. treasury and act entitled to it. Guess who is? The Ukrainians. And it's not just their fault. It's the United States military-industrial complex and the war regime that's led us to this point, using Ukraine for those purposes. But this is a criminal regime that the U.S. is funding. The moment the U.S. sends funds to Russia, maybe I'll care about that more. But that's not happening, and the CIA wants nothing more than for people to continue its propaganda and talk about how evil Russia is, despite the fact that they're not receiving a dime of U.S. money.
Right now. And it raises the question. It's your field. It's my adopted field. What are these motivations? Because you and I are correct. From a logical point of view, this war should stop. There was no reason for the United States to have to push its nose right up against Russia's borders in Ukraine. But that was a plan. That was a plan of the CIA, which I regard as the most dangerous and failed institution of American history.
Amen. And it doesn't take long to prove that. You can go back to the Guatemala coup, the Chilean coup, the Iranian coup in 53, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which got people dead just in attempt to try to convince Kennedy to go full bore with a regime change operation in Cuba. It overthrew the Maidan government. It props up a criminal establishment in Syria that was ascendant because Operation Timber Sycamore dumped $15 billion into Syria, where arms got into the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda to fight against Assad. These are the fruits of the CIA, so Sachs is right about that too.
It's probably still the plan. So this is really the issue. A president of the United States should stand up and explain the truth. Trump does not do that. He doesn't know it's his job, or feel it's his job, or he doesn't have the guts to do it. And there are so many other politicians who in Europe of a leader is standing up and saying, make peace right now. You can hardly find a voice. It's
Orban.
incredible. I don't know what these people want. And also in Europe, the claim is ceasefire. Nobody wants to talk about why there was a war, where it came from, how it should stop permanently. What is that all about? It's a deliberate and sustained evasion that is remarkable, and the opposite of what is really needed to sustain peace.
Yeah, totally true. Trump's a showman. He has immeasurable skill as a salesman, as a deal maker, supposedly. But those real estate deals that he secured in New York City don't seem to translate too well when it comes to securing peace around the world, especially when you have this multi-billion-dollar enterprise of lobbies pulling at him and keeping him in this war. That's why these presidential elections don't seem to decide that much. There's an alarming amount of continuity when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, regardless of who you elect. Like my good friend Tom Woods says, no matter who you elect, you always get John McCain, and you are seeing that to be the case. And it's because the history is ignored, as Sachs said there at the end. Trump won't talk about the root causes of this war in a way that's actually historically true. When he talks about that, he just says that's a war that shouldn't have happened. Biden was weak, and that's why the war happened. He said that many, many times when asked about the genesis of this war. But the truth is, this is a multi-administrative war that panned out over the course of several decades, essentially from 1990 onward, where James Baker's words that NATO wouldn't be expanded eastward were betrayed by the United States government, beginning with Clinton. That ultimately began in, that decision essentially in 1994, several waves of NATO expansion, bombing of Serbia. You had the Maidan coup, where the U.S. aided in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government in 2014. Minsk II Accord, which meant that, Ukraine had to give the oblasts in the Donbass, they had to give them sovereignty recognized in the Constitution, essentially political autonomy. They never did that. Instead, the U.S. under Trump at first pumped in weapons for the first time in those years where Trump was in office, things that Obama wouldn't even do during this period. And then Trump sends $400 million into Ukraine. The Democrats did threaten to impeach him if he didn't do that. They still impeached him regardless, and he still did that. And he still talks about this being Biden's war. And yeah, Biden deserves a lot of the blame too. It's not like the deep state wasn't for this war the whole time anyways. This is the deep state and the war regime's war too. But Biden's policy was atrocious. But what has he done instead of reversing Biden's policy? He's just embraced it with a few minor modifications to look good enough, I guess, to pass that as legitimate to his Republican supporters. Opening negotiations with Russia is a big deal. That's a good thing. But it hasn't really borne fruit. He hasn't switched up the policy. So it's all smoke and mirrors. What we need is what Sachs said, get to the root causes. Say Ukraine won't be part of NATO. We're going to withdraw NATO resources from that region. Russia is going to get the Donbass oblasts and Crimea, and that is the default anyways. That's what Russia has now. And if that happens and the U.S. disengages, there will be a peace. And it's going to be on terms worse than Zelensky could have accepted in the early weeks of the war after Ukraine invaded, I should say, not the war itself. But there were better offers on the table for him at Istanbul, and he's never going to get that kind of offer again. So that's where we're at. Let me know down below, do you agree with Jeffrey Sachs on this? What can the U.S. do to get out of this war and end this war? And what is the ramifications of this if this war continues? Let me know down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Glenn Deason too. He is awesome. Please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you'll help support the channel. And as thanks in return for that, I will give you access to all my videos before they go live on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.